27-year-old martyr Vento was working the night shifts behind the front desk at a travel lodge in Dorset, England, on December the 9th of 2020. The young woman, originally from Valencia, Spain, was taken entirely by surprise when a male guest launched a sudden and vicious attack on her in the foyer of the Bournemouth Hotel, later identified as 32-year-old Stephen Cole. The man chased Vento into an alcove where he repeatedly punched and kicked her until she became unresponsive. She ultimately died from multiple blunt force head injuries. Vento was the only employee behind the desk for the night shift and consequently wasn't found until horrified guests came across her bloodied corpse the next morning. In the incident's aftermath, it was revealed that Cole was a diagnosed schizophrenic who'd stopped taking his prescribed medication. As a result, he'd been experiencing persecutory delusions, auditory hallucinations, and disorganized thinking, which included the belief that smoke detectors were surveying him. Following a mental health evaluation, it was determined that Cole's attack had been triggered by the way in which Vento had smiled at him from behind the reception desk. He was reportedly staying at the travel lodge on his parents' dime after being kicked out of another hotel for attacking two guests just days earlier. Though initially detained for murder, Cole eventually pleaded guilty to manslaughter by reason of diminished responsibility. In the summer of 2021, Judge Angela Morris of the Winchester Crown Court gave Cole an indefinite hospital order in lieu of jail time. Number 6. Asante Campbell. Before leaving home to work the graveyard shift on the night of February the 29th of 2019, North London man Asante Campbell said goodnight to his fiancée and their infant daughter. After departing from his Hendon home, 24-year-old Campbell, a rail worker, was accosted by a group of men who stabbed him through the window of his car. The injuries he sustained in the ambush attack ultimately proved fatal. Police found DNA on the knife sheath used in the stabbing, which was linked to a drill rapper by the name of Javel Hall, aged 18. He was reportedly able to evade capture for several months after the incident by hiding out in Leeds and Manchester, but was eventually tracked down and arrested. During the resulting trial at the Old Bailey, Hall attempted to pass off his own fingerprints as those of his identical twin brother, but his claims of innocence were rejected. Although the motive for the deadly assault wasn't immediately made clear, he was found guilty of murder, along with an accomplice named Kofi Abusa. They both received life sentences with minimum terms of 19 years. In court, Campbell's mother Angela made a victim impact statement in which she recounted her late son's charitable nature and infectious presence. She revealed how Campbell had previously stepped in to play football with a boy who was alone at the park, supported the family of a girl with thoughts of self-harm, and on one occasion, he even drove a complete stranger to the airport. Number 5. Sven Vasquez. On November the 13th of 2022, a violent altercation at a gas station in Queens, New York, left 23-year-old Sven Vasquez dead. The young man, who worked with his brother at a furniture store to provide for his wife and 1-year-old son, had reportedly stopped at a BP station after completing a late-night shift. However, as he was filling up his tank, Vasquez got caught up between two large groups of strangers who were in an argument that eventually boiled over into physical violence. During the course of the brawl, Vasquez was struck over the head with a wooden board and suffered severe injuries that ultimately claimed his life. Although the cause of the fight wasn't known to the police during their initial investigation, eyewitnesses claimed that there were roughly 10 to 12 people involved and that it happened at around 2 a.m. MD Shaika, who was working at the gas station, reported the incident to the authorities after witnessing one of the men grab the wooden board used against Vasquez from a nearby construction site. In the wake of the young man's death, his loved ones honored him with a makeshift memorial near the gas station, outfitted with flowers and candles. Police records indicated that Vasquez, who'd been living in New York for a year and a half after emigrating from Guatemala in search of a better life for his young family, didn't have a criminal record. About a week after the incident, the Regional Fugitive Task Force took 20-year-old Michael Santander into custody in connection with Vasquez's killing. He faced charges of murder, manslaughter, gang assault, and criminal possession of a weapon. Number 4. Andy Ferguson. A 22-year-old intern from Canada was killed in a head-on collision with a gravel truck early one morning in November of 2011. Although the highway was clear and weather conditions were favorable, Andy Ferguson fell asleep at the wheel, causing his vehicle to cross the center line and end up directly in the truck's path. In the wake of the young man's death, his family came out and publicly blamed the accident on his extreme fatigue. He'd reportedly worked 16 hours over a 24-hour period, starting the previous morning and ending with the graveyard shift that night. Ferguson was studying radio and television production at the Northern Alberta Institute of Technology in Edmonton. One of the requirements for him to graduate from the program was completing a 4-month unpaid practicum for Astral Media's local pop rock radio stations. In addition to the hours he put in for the practicum, he was also working shifts as a paid intern. Ferguson had complained to a friend about the exorbitant hours he was being asked to work as recently as during his final overnight shift at the station prior to his death. The Ferguson family subsequently sought to have legislation implemented to protect unpaid interns from exploitation. Number 3. Queensland Postal Service incident. In March of 2017, multiple articles surfaced online detailing how Australia Post employees were forced to work around the dead body of their co-worker for several hours during an overnight shift. 3 postal employees informed the press about the incident, which began after a 49-year-old contractor went into cardiac arrest and died in the Nambour Australia Post building during the early morning hours of March the 9th. Police were called to the scene, but employees at the Queensland facility were allegedly pressured to continue working, despite the man's body still lying on the floor as they awaited the arrival of an undertaker. A blanket was placed over the man and several witches' hats were positioned around his body, but workers otherwise went about their normal routine for the remainder of the graveyard shift. When news of the incident hit the internet, many empathized with the distressed postal employees, one of whom said that Australia Post should be held to account on why dollars were more important than people's well-being and the deceased's dignity. In response, a spokesperson for the mail company stated that while the facility in question had remained operational as the authorities sorted things out, none of the staff members were forced to work. The Community Workers Union of Queensland publicly offered support to those who were left traumatized by the tragic situation. Today's topic was requested by Derek Hagerman, Very Blueberry B, Angela Griggs, and Rosalind Mattison. If you have any other topics you'd like to learn about, subscribe and let us know in the comments section below. Number 2. Kerry Brown. Irish nurse Kerry Brown got into a car accident while driving home from the graveyard shift at Kerry University Hospital on the morning of October the 2nd of 2019. The 26-year-old, who was a finalist at the London Rose of Tralee beauty pageant in 2016, reportedly crashed into an SUV on the N21 in County Kerry. The young woman's vehicle was lifted into the air while the SUV was sent back about 10 feet by the force of the impact. Emergency crews consisting of some of Brown's colleagues rushed to the crash site, but were unable to save her. She was pronounced dead at the scene in spite of extensive life-saving efforts on the part of first responders. Meanwhile, the other motorist, later identified as John Power, needed to be hospitalized for the injuries he sustained. Through an official inquest into the matter, it emerged that Brown had veered into the path of the oncoming SUV in the moments leading up to the collision. Power, a self-employed engineer, reportedly took evasive action by reducing his speed considerably and even driving into a barrier to avoid Brown's Volkswagen Golf, to no avail. The coroner found no evidence that drugs or alcohol had played a role in the tragedy. Rather, it was Brown's extreme tiredness brought on by working a 12-hour overnight shift at the hospital that was identified as the accident's primary cause. Before we show the last listing, please know that if you'd like, you can stay tuned to watch our previous video on when cemeteries go wrong. Pretty fitting, don't you think? Number 1. Britrain Marcellus Gray. At approximately 4:45 a.m. on May the 13th of 2022, gunfire broke out in a McDonald's located at 1130 Crane Highway South in Gambrills, Maryland. Responding police officers came upon a deceased man who'd sustained apparent gunshot wounds, later identified as 23-year-old Odenton resident betraying Marcellus Gray. The victim had reportedly been working the graveyard shift at the fast food eatery's drive-through window when he was shot to death by a customer. A couple months later, homicide detectives announced that they'd identified a suspect in the case. 21-year-old Juan Green from Middle River was the individual determined to have been responsible for the deadly shooting, which investigators believed to be a targeted attack rather than a random act of violence. Green was taken into custody on a charge of first-degree murder. However, according to police records, he was also charged in connection with an unrelated triple shooting that occurred in Prince George's County on June the 13th, which resulted in one death. As of the latest updates on the case, investigators were still working to ascertain the circumstances that led to Green's fatal confrontation with Gray.
Number 9. Maria Elizabeth Pena Echeveria. Teenager Maria Elizabeth Pena Echeveria was arrested by North Carolina law enforcement in May of 2021 in connection to a man's brutal killing at Mount Olivet Cemetery in Raleigh. According to an official press release, 69-year-old James Lacey Taylor had been found critically injured on the cemetery's grounds on the night of May the 28th. He was officially pronounced dead upon being transported to a nearby hospital. People who'd been present at the graveyard around the time of the incident told investigators that they'd seen two men and a woman fleeing the scene in two separate vehicles, a dark-colored pickup truck and a sedan that was either brown or blue. A state worker subsequently came upon a pile of clothes, shoes, and latex gloves positioned near a splatter of blood on the ground, prompting them to dial 911. Officers found Taylor gravely wounded, a short distance from the rest of the articles of evidence. The day after Pena Echeveria's arrest, the authorities announced that two additional teenage suspects, one of whom was named as Jonathan Dan Villanueva Gala, had been taken into custody on suspicion of being involved in Taylor's murder. When the shooting occurred, Villanueva Gala was reportedly out on parole for previous convictions that included driving while impaired and felony breaking and entering. Number 8. Yolanda Galgia. Police in Killeen, Texas, received reports of a shooting at the Calvary Baptist Church Garden of Memories Cemetery shortly after 5 p.m. on March the 22nd of 2022. When officers arrived at the scene, they found a pair of gunshot victims, one of whom was treated for minor injuries by emergency responders and released a short time later. The other victim, 52-year-old Yolanda Galgia, had sustained far more severe injuries, and she was ultimately pronounced dead about 2 hours later. In the incident's aftermath, it was detailed how on the day of her death, Galgia had gone to the cemetery to visit her deceased son's gravesite on what would have been his 22nd birthday. Although the cause of death for Galgia's son wasn't specified in subsequent reports, Facebook posts from the young man's father indicated that he'd passed away on New Year's Day 2022. Killeen police immediately launched an investigation into the fatal shooting, but as of the case's most recent updates, a suspect hadn't yet been identified. Number 7. Elvira Navarro. New York woman Elvira Navarro was tending to graves at Baron Hirsch Cemetery in Staten Island on October the 28th of 2021 when a massive headstone toppled to the ground. According to the Navarro family's attorney, the 2,000-pound monument fell directly on top of the 53-year-old woman while she was working next to her son, Anthony Rosales. Navarro was taken to Richmond University Medical Center, where she ultimately died as a result of her crushing injuries. On the day of the tragic accident, Navarro and her son had been dispatched to the Graniteville burial grounds to perform some work at the site on behalf of their third-party employer. In the incident's aftermath, the family filed a negligence lawsuit in Manhattan Supreme Court against the Baron Hirsch Cemetery Association. The civil litigation alleged that Navarro's death had been directly caused by the organization's failure to properly maintain the grounds. Number 6. Sheamus Burcham. On the morning of Christmas Eve 2021, the Meridian Police Department in Mississippi received a call about two men roaming through Mecklemore Cemetery with metal detectors. Officers were dispatched to the scene a short time later and came upon a man later identified as Sheamus Burcham as he was in the process of digging up a grave. In a statement released by the department's police patrol sergeant, the suspect hadn't dug very deep by the time he was found by law enforcement, who immediately took him into custody. Burcham was consequently charged with desecration of a cemetery or corpses, a misdemeanor in the state of Mississippi. Number 5. The Shantae King Sr.'s funeral. On June the 2nd of 2022, gunfire broke out during an afternoon funeral at the Graceland Cemetery in Racine, Wisconsin. The memorial service, as was detailed in subsequent reports, was being held in honor of Shantae King Sr., a local man who'd been killed by the police during a shootout precipitated by a contentious traffic stop. The Racine chief of police indicated that officers had initially pulled King over to execute a search warrant for a felon in possession of a gun. The situation abruptly escalated after King had got out of his vehicle and started fleeing on foot. Officers gave chase and eventually resorted to shooting the man because he'd reportedly refused to drop his weapon. In the wake of the funeral shooting, investigators gathered from witness testimony that there'd been between 20 and 30 gunshots fired in total. It subsequently emerged that as many as 5 mourners had been injured in the incident, some of whom were identified as members of King's family. Fortunately, no one was killed in the attack. As of the latest updates on the matter, Racine police were still working to identify the individual or group responsible for the incident. Number 4. Dale Laprade. In September of 2018, the authorities in Bridgeport, Connecticut, received reports that more than 100 graves at Park City Cemetery had been disturbed, stacked, or desecrated. City officials launched an investigation to ascertain the reason for the dilapidated condition of the grounds. Officers sent to inspect the area reportedly found disturbed dirt, garbage, and overturned headstones, haphazardly strewn across the graveyard. Detectives also discovered bone fragments and pieces of caskets that dated back more than 100 years. Some of the detritus had been discarded on the ground of the cemetery, while other bits of debris were found in the woods nearby. In December of 2018, it was announced during a news conference that the police had arrested Dale Laprade, the operator of the Park City Cemetery. She was accused of intentionally disturbing plots in the cemetery, some of which reportedly belonged to Civil War veterans, in order to create space for new graves. In the wake of Laprade's arrest, it also emerged that the 64-year-old had allegedly embezzled more than $60,000 of the cemetery's money during her tenure as the historic site's manager. While awaiting her trial on charges of first-degree larceny, second-degree larceny, and interfering with the cemetery, Laprade reportedly passed away from complications stemming from cardiovascular disease. Number 3. Jose Luis Torres Garcia. On February the 17th of 2020, several people were gunned down at the Perris Valley Cemetery in Perris, California. The Riverside County Sheriff's Department soon identified 33-year-old Jose Luis Torres Garcia as the prime suspect in what was a triple murder investigation. Garcia, a twice-deported Mexican national, was reportedly with the victims all night leading up to their violent deaths. While investigators didn't disclose a specific motive for the killings, suspicions arose that they were somehow connected to cartel violence south of the border. After reports surfaced that Garcia was wanted in connection to the incident, he fled California, triggering an extensive manhunt that extended into neighboring states. Law enforcement in Cheyenne, Wyoming, eventually spotted him driving a 2007 GMC Yukon on Interstate 80 and detained him without further incident. He was jailed at the Laramie County Detention Center pending his extradition back to California to stand trial for murder. Today's topic was requested by The One Silver Shadow and Dead Girl 77. If you have any other topics you'd like to learn about, subscribe and let us know in the comments section below. Number 2. Brian Montavo Tolentino and Juan Burgos Lopez. The Lake County Sheriff's Office in Florida received reports of vandalism at Edgewood Cemetery in early December of 2020. Deputies who'd been dispatched to inspect the scene reportedly discovered that grave robbers had dug up 4 separate graves and stolen human remains from each of the burial sites. It was also determined that the vandals had damaged a 5th grave, which they'd ultimately abandoned without gaining access to it. In January of the following year, police announced that they'd identified a pair of suspects named as Brian Montavo Tolentino and Juan Burgos Lopez. During a news conference, local authorities detailed how the men had allegedly performed the grave robbery for ritualistic purposes. Prior to vandalizing the burial sites, Tolentino and Lopez had reportedly spit Bacardi rum on the ground and exhaled cigar smoke near the headstones, which was done in order to protect them from evil spirits. In doing so, they inadvertently provided law enforcement with evidence, as investigators subsequently used the DNA found on cigars left at the crime scene to identify them. It was further revealed that the vandals had targeted the burial sites of military veterans whom they'd believed to have stronger spirits. Tolentino and Lopez were booked into the Polk County Jail on 4 counts each of disturbing the contents of a grave and abuse of a dead body. Number 1. Mujera Benjamin Longaho. Arkansas police was made aware of a vandalism incident at Oakland Cemetery Park in Little Rock in the summer of 2020. As it was subsequently reported, an individual had spray painted various phrases on a Confederate memorial obelisk and several other grave sites on the night of July the 9th. Investigators determined that the suspect had intended the graffiti to be a form of protest against the controversial structures erected in honor of key figures of the Confederate South during the American Civil War. The 20-foot stone monument was covered in politically charged phrases such as "Black Lives Matter," "No Justice, No Peace," as well as derogatory statements directed toward then-President Donald Trump. The police were able to use surveillance footage from the cemetery to identify the perpetrator as 30-year-old Mujera Benjamin Longaho. He was taken into custody on charges of first-degree criminal mischief and desecration or removal of a cemetery or grave marker. Officials publicly announced that the man had further been charged with conspiracy and use of explosive materials for malicious damage to federal property. The accusations were connected to an incident in which he'd allegedly thrown firebombs at police vehicles. Longaho pleaded not guilty to each of the offenses, and his attorney filed a motion to have all his federal charges dismissed.
Thanks for watching. Would you rather be scheduled to work the graveyard shift each and every weekend or have a mandatory curfew of 8 p.m? Let us know in the comment section below.